Hello everyone, and welcome to the final panel for day one of the Sporting Chance Forum 2021, organised by the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. Our panel today is entitled Sex and Gender in Sports Policy, a Human Rights Perspective. My name is Madeline Pape, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session, in which we're going to be talking about how sports governing bodies can bring a human rights perspective to their policies for inclusion in women's sport in particular. I am a sociologist. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Sport Sciences at the University of Lausanne. Previously, I was an elite 800-metre runner. I competed for Australia at the Beijing Olympics in 2008 and at the World Championships in Berlin in 2009, before going on to do my PhD on this very topic. Before I introduce our panellists, I'd like to just begin by orienting all of us with respect to the terminology that we're going to be using today. Our discussion primarily concerns two groups of women athletes: women with variations in their sex characteristics and trans women. By women with variations in their sex characteristics, we mean women whose sex-linked traits do not align with taken for granted or normative notions of the male or female body. So, for example, there exists a range of entirely natural chromosomal variations beyond simply XX and XY. So these are women who have typically been raised as women. By contrast, trans women athletes, or trans people more broadly, are those people whose gender identity or sense of self does not align with the sex category that they were assigned at birth. I want to emphasize that these two groups of women athletes are distinct from one another, and their participation in elite sport has been subject to distinct sets of regulations. I also want to emphasize that these are two very diverse groups of women. In the case of trans women, for example, their transition journeys can vary enormously, from the age at which they begin their transition to the forms of gender affirming care that they seek, or even whether they seek such care at all. So it's important to note that not all trans people consider a medical transition to be the right choice for them. And sometimes there might also be economic barriers that make certain forms of care inaccessible. And there are many other sources of diversity as well within each of these groups of women athletes. In order to ensure that the voices of those athletes directly affected are adequately heard, we've prepared two pre-recorded events. So the first is entitled The Voice of Transgender Athletes, which was organised in partnership with Athlete Ally. The second is called The Voice of Athletes with Variations in Sex Characteristics, which was led by Dr. Payoshni Mitra, a global expert on this issue. And both of these very important and insightful sessions are now available to watch at the Sporting Chance Forum 2021 website. Now, before I go on to explaining the agenda for our session today, I just want to briefly give a trigger warning. So both the pre-recorded side events and today's live session, which I'll note is being recorded, touch on issues of harm. So please do feel free to step away at any time if you wish to, and please also consider seeking support if what we discuss today causes you distress. So I'm now going to turn to the purpose of today's panel. It is fair to say that it has been a rough ride for this topic in recent years, especially for those athletes directly affected by eligibility regulations, but also for sports governing bodies, given the extent of divisive public debate and polarisation that we've witnessed. And much of the debate to date has focused on questions of science. So questions such as, can and how can the boundaries of the female athlete category be scientifically defined? What measurable criteria or forms of scientific evidence might we use to decide the conditions of participation for trans women and women with variations in their sex characteristics, and so on. However, it has become increasingly clear that a purely scientific approach does not deliver the clean-cut and responsible answers that sports governing bodies and sports stakeholders are hoping for. So for this panel, we've decided to explore a different approach. We've asked our participants to reflect instead on what it might look like to approach inclusion in women's sport from a human rights perspective. Historically, this conversation has been had without a human rights-based approach. However, we're now seeing bodies like the UN Human Rights Council writing reports about this issue. The Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights is also engaged. And these actors have mobilised around this issue because serious harms have occurred. And when that happens, we have to examine why and consider what our alternatives are. So what might a human rights-based approach to this issue look like in practice? This is the question we're going to put to some of our panelists today. And this is the invitation that we're making to all of you who are attending to make room over the next hour to listen in and reflect on what a human rights approach might mean to you when it comes to the inclusion in sport of transgender women athletes and women with variations in their sex characteristics. All right, so let's get into it. In order to appreciate what's at stake when we're talking about applying a human rights-based approach to this issue, we're going to start by hearing from two athletes who've been directly affected by eligibility regulations. First, we're going to watch a short video testimony by Annet Negesa, a Ugandan 800-metre runner whose life was changed forever when she was advised that she needed to lower her naturally occurring testosterone levels. Now, Annet has been very courageous in publicly sharing the extent of the physical and emotional harms that she has endured over recent years. And although she's unable to join us in person today, she has generously prepared a short video for us. After that video, I will then invite Dr. Veronica Ivy to share her perspective as a trans woman and expert on human rights in sport. Dr. Ivy is a two-time Masters track cycling world champion and former Masters world record holder, and we're very grateful to you, Veronica, that you can join us today. We'll then hear from three practitioners of human rights. We'll begin with Kalekye, who is an Associate Human Rights Officer at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Kalekye has worked extensively on the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex people. So thank you for joining us today, Kalekye. We're also joined by Magali Matovic, who is the Head of Human Rights at the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, where she leads the development and implementation of the IOC's strategic human rights approach. So welcome, Magali. And finally, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Andreas Graf, who is the Head of Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination at FIFA, and who has been intimately involved in the development of FIFA's human rights policy. So welcome, Andreas. So at this point, I'll ask our technical team to take us to Annet Negesa's short video. Thank you.
Sport gave me happiness, running made me feel free, made me feel good about myself. It gave me that taste of success. Sport was life for me. Sport also helped me and other women from the global south to be financially independent, to be able to pay for our own education. When I was forced to stop competing, I lost my scholarship at the university, and I could not continue with my higher education. In 2012, I was impacted by World Athletics hyperandrogenism regulations. They asked me to undergo invasive medical tests and eventually made me take harmful medical steps without informed consent. Such things continue to happen under the current DSD regulations of the IAAF or World Athletics. I often work with Dr. Payashini Mitra and speak to young women athletes in different parts of the world and advise them to try and get all information before agreeing to take medical steps. I don't want them to regret all their lives. Don't want them to fail. As helpless as I felt 9 years ago. They must know that these surgeries are irreversible, that they impact our lives beyond sport. I'm glad that people are listening to us. I'm glad that Center for Sport and Human Rights have given athletes like me the platform to talk about it. I have been in touch with footballer Ativa Horari's story, as Dr. Parshini Mitra put us in touch. Amitanao Sieni is a fantastic athlete and deserves to be treated better. I hope the Center for Sport and Human Rights will also take some action to ensure that our human rights are respected in sport. We are humans first, athletes second. Our lives matter beyond sport. I urge World Athletics to not force us to take these unnecessary medical steps and to treat us with dignity and respect that we truly deserve. I keep telling people about how trapped I felt when I was investigated and told that the only way I can compete was if I agreed to take medical steps. I hope no other girl or woman experience what I did. I love sport and I love sport to be safe for all. I want all girls and women, including those with variation of sex characteristics, to only experience positive changes through sport.
I'm so glad that Annet was willing to share this message with us today, because her story is just so important to recognise as an example of the kinds of harms that can occur under eligibility regulation, even when sports governing bodies believe that they've put the necessary checks and balances in place. I'd now like to invite you, Veronica, to share your perspective with us. I know that sport has a central place in your life, and cycling in particular. How has the absence of a human rights-based approach to the participation of trans women impacted you? And why do you see a human rights lens as critically important?
Yeah, thank you. I want to do my best to represent trans communities rather than just myself. And what I've seen is that sport, particularly with the IOC, is already allegedly adopting a human rights perspective, but questions arise in its effectiveness of enacting their own principles. So if people will oblige, I like to read some of the fundamental principles of Olympism to get things going. So first, Olympism is a philosophy of life, exalting and combining in a balanced whole the qualities of body, will, and mind. Blending sport with culture and education, Olympism seeks to create a way of life based on the joy of effort, the educational value of good example, social responsibility, and respect for universal fundamental ethical principles. Second, the goal of Olympism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind, with a view to promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity. And fourth, the practice of sport is a human right. Every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind and in the Olympic spirit, which requires mutual understanding with a spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. And I seriously applaud every one of those principles. I think that they are exactly what sport, not just Olympic sport, but sport should be about, and they should be the sorts of principles that all sport federations should aspire to. The problem is their implementation and how that has affected trans athletes. So I would say that particularly the last 2 years have been very bad for trans athletes. And that has honestly culminated in some shock with what happened at the Tokyo Olympics. So trans athletes have long been under what I now understand is a misunderstanding of the IOC's, they're not regulations, but recommendations for policies for trans inclusion dating back to 2003 and then updated in 2015 to allow for inclusion of transgender athletes, provided certain eligibility criteria. However, one sport body, World Rugby, recently instituted a flat transgender woman ban based on no evidence of trans women athletes themselves. What they did is they compared cisgender male athletes to cisgender female athletes, and on the basis of that, banned trans women. And then the Olympics allowed rugby to participate at the Olympics with a transgender ban, while the Olympics has this recommendation of including trans women, and yet has these principles of Olympism that suggests that we should be concerned with fundamental ethical principles, the respect for human dignity, that sport is a human right. So what that has communicated to trans communities is that there is no protection for us, even when an organization explicitly adopts a human rights perspective. What this tells us, and trans people are angry and scared and confused, and we feel betrayed because without any scientific justification, a major sports federation was allowed to ban completely trans women athletes and then still be allowed into the Olympics. And so what this means is now it is open season against trans women athletes. Any international federation, including my international federation, the UCI, could conceivably simply decide on a whim to ban trans women athletes entirely. And it seems like there will be zero consequences for them. So what bothers me is that certain sports federations and organizations, and particularly a globally leading one like the IOC, explicitly adopts a human rights perspective and yet seems to allow these human rights violations. And the second example I want to point to is what's happened with World Athletics and the sorts of justifications that people like Stefan Berman have given for having these eligibility criteria, and by excluding women like Caster Semenya and Annet. So in an interview, he says, if you have a high, and I'm quoting, if you have a high testosterone level and you're socially accepted as a woman and want to look like a woman and compete with women, the treatments that affirm your female gender are the standard of care for you. We do nothing to fit people into the norm. If a person claims to be a woman and wants to compete in the protected category, in the protected female category, then she should be happy to lower her testosterone level. If this is not the case, then one must ask questions, first about her true sexual identity, and second about possible secondary benefits to maintain, such as her high testosterone levels. This is a basic violation of the human dignity of bodily autonomy. These medical interventions that are being put in place as eligibility criteria for competition are not health-based. They are not for the health of the athlete. And people like Annet have testified that often these medical interventions make them less healthy. And so if we're going to take this human rights perspective seriously, and the respect for human dignity and the respect for bodily autonomy, we can't have these sorts of policies that put us in this bind where we have to decide between sport, which is supposed to be a human right, and our bodily autonomy, and possibly making us less healthy just in order to compete. So with all of this going on, and the fact that both World Athletics was allowed to do this and that World Rugby was allowed to do this and still compete in the Olympics with those avowed values, makes the trans communities confused and scared. And I'm just begging the IOC and other organizations to follow through on your own avowed principles?
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I can imagine that the work that you're doing to make women's sport both equitable and inclusive is truly exhausting work, but your voice is so unique and so important. So thank you for being prepared to put yourself forward again to share this perspective with us. We're now going to take a step back and attempt to wrap our heads around what a human rights-based approach is and what it means to apply it to the sports participation of trans women and women with variations in their sex characteristics. And so I'm going to ask you, Kalekye, to help us with this. Kalekye, what do we need to know about human rights in this context?
So thanks, Madeline. And this is quite a complex question. I'll try and break it down in several parts so that we see how a human rights-based approach would look like in the sporting world. To begin with, there's a robust framework of human rights norms and standards, which first and foremost place obligations on states to prevent and provide redress for discrimination. So these are enshrined, for example, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, for example. And lastly, there's also the Convention Against Torture, which prohibits torture and ill treatment, which is one of the things that we see is an effect of some of the regulations that have been passed by sporting bodies. And lastly, for sport bodies, there's the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which provide a key framework to understand the nature and scope of state obligations, but also non-state actor responsibilities, and with respect to human rights, and in this case, including sport. So if we had a human rights-based approach in this particular discussion, it will highlight that the fundamental human rights of persons, including women athletes, must be respected, protected, and upheld in the context of sport, and that sport organizations and federations, as well as states, have responsibilities and obligations to ensure that this is the case. So, for example, with relation to trans athletes or trans women athletes, they should all have the right to legal gender recognition of their gender identity based on self-identification and through a simple administrative procedure and devoid of any abusive requirements such as sterilization, medical or psychiatric certification, or even divorce. So trans women are women and are part of the beautiful diversity among women, which should be respected in the context of sport. Another example is that no one should be forced or coerced to undergo any medical intervention as a prerequisite to participate in sport. So women with diverse sex characteristics or intersex variations should not have to undergo any diagnostic or medical intervention as a requirement to participate in specific disciplines. States also have clear obligations to ban discrimination based on gender identity or expression, and also on sex characteristics, and this also applies to the sporting world. A human rights-based approach is also about ensuring that people are consulted and participate in decisions that impact on them. So, for example, policies that impact trans athletes and athletes with intersex variations require that they be fully consulted and participate in these decision-making processes. A human rights-based approach is really about upholding the inherent dignity of all persons and ensuring that women and girls in all their diversity, and including trans women and women with diverse sex characteristics, are able to participate in sport at all levels, be it amateur or elite. Lack of upholding a human rights-based approach leads to violation of fundamental human rights, and Veronica has alluded to some of these. They include a violation of the right to the highest attainable physical and mental health, including sexual reproductive health and rights. It violates the right to privacy, right to work, right to equality and non-discrimination, right to bodily autonomy and integrity, and freedom from torture and ill treatment. So how then can sporting bodies ensure that they have a human rights-based approach? Sport governing bodies should commit themselves to protecting and respecting internationally recognized human rights, and they should meet their responsibilities to protect rights and minimize harms by adopting human rights policies that apply to not only athletes, but also events, competitions, fans, journalists, among others. They should also commit themselves in reviewing and revising their policies, and this could include by putting in place transparent monitoring processes that assess the negative impacts on their rights as a step towards meeting their responsibilities, establish practices of due diligence in tracking and responding to reports of discrimination and abuse in sport, protect athletes' right to remedy, and ensure access to effective remedy and justice mechanisms that are based on human rights standards, ensure effective forms of redress that conform with international human rights law, and that they should also ensure that these forms of redress are equally accessible to all athletes, regardless of their resources or their geographic backgrounds. Lastly, two last points, they should review, revise, and revoke rules, regulations, and policies that have a negative effect on athletes' rights. And lastly, they should consult with trans women and women with intersex variations and their organizations in revising existing regulations and in the development of future policies and regulations that have an impact on them.
Thank you, Kalekye. I think it's so important for us to all appreciate why the UN and the OHCHR in particular are taking such a keen interest in this issue of eligibility regulation in women's sports. So thank you for that very thorough overview. Now, there are various sports governing bodies who are heeding the call to consider human rights in relation to this issue. And two such organisations are on our panel today: FIFA, which has made a statutory commitment to human rights, and the IOC, which has been working towards developing and implementing a human rights strategy. So this is really a great opportunity for us to learn more about what sports governing bodies can and are practically doing in order to approach inclusion from a human rights perspective. Perhaps I'll start with you, Magali, and ask you to walk us through the process that the IOC has been undertaking in relation to this issue.
Sure, of course. Thanks, Madeleine. So yeah, before we start talking about the process, I just want to share that the IOC framework is not yet released, so we will not be in a position to share a lot of details about its actual content, but we'll share, of course, the overall process and the rationale for it. So before we start, talking about the whole thing, I felt it would be good to reset a bit and revisit this global context in which we are developing this framework. So if it's okay with you, I'll start with some general consideration from the IOC's perspective, and at the same time, I'll address some of your points, Dr. Ivy, and then we'll dig into where we are with the development of the framework. So first, indeed, the IOC committed to strengthen its human rights approach, and this is reflected in our strategic roadmap called Agenda 2020+5. It consists of 15 key recommendations, including one, of course, on corporate citizenships, where human rights and gender equality feature. So it's worth noting, of course, the IOC has taken some steps towards its human rights responsibilities, and the work we are doing on athletes' inclusion keeps directly in line with this commitment of streamlining a human rights approach, across the ways of working in the organization. So indeed, as Dr. Ivy mentioned, the starting point should really be our commitment to inclusion across the Olympic movement, and we do recognize in the fundamental principle 6 that all athletes, regardless of their gender identity or sex characteristics, should engage in safe and fair competition. This is grounded in the Olympic Charter, and so in that way, transgender athletes have been allowed to compete since 2003. We currently are under a different ruling. We are under the ruling, recommendation. Indeed, in 2015, the IOC produced a revised consensus statement addressing the participation of athletes with sex reassignment and specified as well some ground rules on hyperandrogenism for female athletes. So what's important to remember, and Dr. Ivy touched on it, is this statement is a guiding document that may be taken into account by sports organization when they determine their eligibility criteria or not, right? It's important to understand that the statement does not regulate, participation at the Olympic Games per se, since those eligibility criteria are indeed set by the International Federation. A majority have based their rules on IOC guidelines, and others have taken a different approach, as Dr. Ivy mentioned. When we go back to the 2015 consensus statement, it's a scientific consensus, and it establishes the following. First, transgender men are allowed to compete in the male category without restriction, and transgender women are allowed to compete in the female category if they keep a level of testosterone below or off 10 nanomilliliter per liter for at least 12 months. And so since 2015, there's been several developments at different fronts: social front, human rights, the legal level. The general debate around LGBTQI rights has also increased and become, as Madeleine mentioned at the beginning of her introductory speech, very divisive and very complex. So what we are seeing is, from a medical perspective, there's been an increase in the research done, but we're not in a position to have strong evidence that either trans or intersex women have a clear competitive advantage. Most of the studies relied on a form of extrapolation of a small sample of data, and this data very often does not include enough well-trained elite athletes to really be conclusive and well accepted in the medical world. Another very interesting development in the medical field has been the positioning of the World Medical Association in 2019, where they position themselves against the eligibility rules that require unnecessary medical procedures. And they called on for physicians, doctors, basically around the world, to not implement some of the guidelines for classifying female athletes. Then, of course, from a society perspective, we're seeing a very highly politicized and divisive debates, making it seem like one either has to be either in favor of women in sport or in favor of transgender and intersex athletes. It seems like the two cannot, coexist. And as Kalekye mentioned, of course, from an international perspective, we are seeing, the Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly, or indeed, OHCHR, taking a stance on the subject and asking states, to legislate to protect the rights to health, the right to livelihoods, bodily integrity, freedom from torture, as we've just heard. So, but at the same time, we as of course sport organization, we need to ensure the relevance and the success of competitive sport, particularly high-level organized sporting competition. And this continues to rely on a level playing field where no athlete has a perceived unfair or disproportionate advantage over the rest, and that safety is guaranteed for all players. Some federations are waiting for the release of our new framework, and others have indeed moved ahead and taking position. What we see is that those conclusions vary from one federation to another. I believe they try to balance all those aspects that I've just talked about, and it's not an easy task. And what's even more complex for them, and of course we'll hear from FIFA in a while, is that they have to cascade down those international regulations at the national level. And in some cases, we have seen that national legislation blocked the implementation of those international rules on the ground of human rights consideration. So I hope that this sort of very short, overview shows a bit the complexity and also the tensions that surround, LGBTQI rights in sports. So the questions that we ask ourselves is then, how do we manage then to reconcile this idea of level playing field, fairness, safety, and at the same time, inclusion, non-discrimination in the women's category. And so now coming to the actual process that we have developed and are continuing to develop, we wanted to really, looked at new opportunities to improve the guidance the IOC has offered to the international federations. And we decided to work on a new and comprehensive approach to address the complexity of this topic. So in October 2019, we decided to kick off this work and integrate a rights-respecting approach to address those perceived tension between fairness, safety, and inclusion, non-discrimination. So how did we go about it? Well, first, we set up a multidisciplinary internal working group, and it's really driving the work. And for the first time, it's made of colleagues from different departments, medical, of course, athletes, sports, legal, and human rights. So this meant that for the first time, we were not only considering the scientific and legal aspect of eligibility, but also human rights considerations. And so to do that, we consulted with affected stakeholders. So we consulted and heard, from trans women athletes and athletes with sex variation to really understand what they went through and also hear their suggestions. We, of course, consulted as well with a number of international federations, since they are really at the forefront of it and the key decision makers in that process to better understand their challenges and help them there. And of course, we consulted with a wide range of other relevant stakeholders that represented many different views and sometimes very diverging views of how we should really go about it. So by engaging in that process and that consultation, and while it's not fully finalized yet, we saw a number of important points really surfacing. So as Madeleine mentioned right at the beginning, of course, the community of transgender and athletes with intersex variation is not homogeneous, in the same way that the community, of course, of cisgender athletes is not. There is no one single transgender body type or intersex body type. Each athlete is different in shape, in size, in muscle mass, in physiology. And so what grants someone an advantage in one sport doesn't mean that this will transfer to another sport, automatically. So in that context, the one-size-fits-all approach and having a one threshold seems very challenging to uphold. And so this raised, three important points. First, instead of setting a threshold, we should really ask ourselves what actually is a disproportionate competitive advantage, and what does that really mean? And two, if we are to do that, then we need to do that on a sport-by-sport basis, or even on a discipline or event basis, since every of those will require different advantage. And three, as a consequence of that, if we are to do that and try to establish what a disproportionate competitive advantage means, then we need to find ways, that are practical, non-intrusive, and respectful to evidence this disproportionate advantage. And finally, what is critical is that all those principles, fairness, inclusion, non-discrimination, avoidance of harm, are part of really a comprehensive decision-making process, which can result in coherent regulation that might or might not restrict access. I don't think it's about participation at all costs. So it still means that restriction might be possible. But what is possible is that the process has to be really inclusive, non-discriminatory, so that any solutions that are, explored are really grounded in the realities and the leading practice of each sport, and respectful of the rights of all athletes, especially the most vulnerable ones. So all of this consideration will result in a new framework that will seek to help international federation to engage in that decision-making process, for them to set their own eligibility criteria that considers inclusion, non-discrimination, prevention of harm, as well as fairness. Just on the practical side, the framework is set to be released at the very latest after the Beijing Games, and will of course be subject to periodic review and so that we continue take into consideration the development in this area.
Thanks, Magali, for giving us that comprehensive background. I think, as Dr. Ivy alluded to, there's no question that the IOC has the opportunity to be a really great leader in this space. I think including in terms of challenging some of the concepts that do get thrown around quite often, such as level playing field, which I think has been comprehensively shown to be used at times very subjectively and in order to advance certain agendas. So we thank you, Magali, for giving us a sense of where the IOC is at and what that process has looked like to date. I'm now going to invite you, Andreas, to provide the perspective of an international federation and to share with us some of the work that FIFA has been doing to bring a human rights perspective to the question of inclusion in football.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madeleine, and thanks to the other panelists. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. It is a very timely conversation to have amongst all of us. I believe our input connects quite well to the presentation that Magali just did from the IOC. Of course, we operate in the same environment, in the same context that she just described. And we are in many respects at a similar point in the process towards revised regulations. The IOC, of course, works on an overarching framework that can provide guidance to sports federations. Well, we are one of those federations, and we really look forward to seeing then the final product of the IOC and how it rhymes with our own work. So in parallel with the IOC's process, FIFA has started its own process to review the regulations on eligibility of players in relation to gender for its own tournaments. The current regulations were developed back in 2011. At the most general level, they state that every participating federation has an obligation to nominate a team of players that is eligible for the respective category, male or female category. And then the regulations define a process through which a potential protest, for example, by a competing team at a tournament against the eligibility of one of the players who are fielded in the tournament, how such a process will be handled. Now, under the regulations, should such a complaint be filed, an expert panel put in place by FIFA and been on standby since 2011 would take an independent decision on the eligibility of a player in such a situation. Now, as I've just alluded to before, over the past 10 years, this process has never been activated. So there's never been a protest on that basis. So there's very limited experience on the implementation of those processes at FIFA tournaments themselves. When we look at the process through which we review those existing regulations, I mean, Magali has shared how the debate on the topic has evolved, how we operate in a completely different environment with different sensitivities to what was the case back in 2011. We've set ourselves a number of guiding principles for the work we do to revise those regulations. First, it's FIFA's aim to develop regulations that ensure the inherent dignity and rights of those affected, especially transgender players and players with variations in their sex characteristics. Now, if we speak about rights, relevant rights are, for example, the right to gender self-determination as an important starting point, the right to access to sport, and the basic principle of non-discrimination. And then, importantly, a right to physical and mental integrity, the right to privacy, which need to inform any process that is put in place through those regulations. A second key principle, key parameter is to ensure that the regulations are built around inclusion as a fundamental principle and starting point, which also means that any potential exclusion of a player from participating in the category corresponding to their gender identity, to the gender with which they identify, needs to be proportionate and necessary to protect a higher good. Now, we've heard that before. What could be higher goods in that respect? Maybe fairness of competition or health and safety. But that's very much part of the conversations that we are having currently. At the same time, any decision in that respect will need to be based on a case-by-case analysis, on an objective assessment, and any step along the process, it would need to be respectful to the athlete concerned and non-intrusive. And the third principle I'd like to mention for the review of the regulation is that it has to take into account the significance of the regulations beyond FIFA tournaments. Of course, the processes put in place are specifically to FIFA tournaments, but they do reflect on the wider football universe. And we consider it important that through our regulations, we provide support and guidance to FIFA's member associations on how to address this particular topic in a human rights compliant manner. So these maybe three basic principles around which we have structured our conversation internally. We've had those, we've been involved in those revisions over the past several months and within the FIFA administration, together with colleagues from the FIFA medical and legal departments. And if I say we, it's the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination and department within FIFA. We have so far consulted with selected experts along the process to get additional perspectives and expertise. And we have also been in touch with the IOC on the topic to understand their thinking, their process. The next step in the process will be to reach out to a wider group of stakeholders that includes transgender athletes and allies in sports, as well as player representatives and additional experts in the field. That is very much now for us the next step, reaching out to a wider group of stakeholders to see how what we've been working on internally with the help of some selected experts will be perceived by those stakeholders and take those views into account. And then, of course, the recommended revisions by the FIFA administration will be submitted to FIFA's decision-making bodies for final reviews and decision, which can really be will be the final step in the process towards those new regulations. All right, I think I'll stop here for the time being. Take the opportunity to thank everyone who has contributed to that process so far, and also those who we will be reaching out over the next weeks and months as part of the consultation process. Greatly looking forward to those conversations.
Thank you, Andreas. It seems like we're catching you at a really interesting moment at FIFA as this process is unfolding, and it's certainly helpful for us to think about what this looks like at the international federation level. And Magali, I'm wondering if this is something that you can speak to as well. As you outlined, the IOC has engaged in an extensive consultation process with stakeholders, and that has included federations. And I'm wondering what you've seen or heard in terms of the common challenges that national and international federations are raising, as well as perhaps what opportunities you've seen along the way for federations in terms of bringing a human rights-based approach to this issue.
Sure. Yes, Madeleine. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we did indeed, consulted with a number of international federation. Since they are the one, really establishing those criteria was really critical for the process to understand, their perspective and what they were, thinking or doing actually around the topic of athletes inclusion. So as I said, since the framework's not fully released, I'm not in a position to share a lot of details on the consultation themselves. So I'm not really able to share, what the federation specifically said. But we do see loads of challenges, of course, in the public domain. I think Dr. Ivy touched on two interesting cases. They are fairly public, so we are seeing indeed World Rugby, in a situation where indeed they set up, international rules which cannot be implemented at national levels because indeed in certain countries, they would go directly against anti-discrimination law. That's the case for Canada, but also Australia. We are seeing, of of course, similar, issues for world athletics as well are fairly public. So of course, there are definitely challenges on that, and that specific challenge they have around the international rules that have to fit in different, national framework. And it's a bit like a piece of a jigsaw. And that goes back to what Kalekye was saying, right? It all starts with basically states that they have to really protect, affected population and reflecting this in their own legislation. So yeah. But again, going back to what we were saying, I really think it boils down to how can international bodies can really balance those concepts of fairness, safety, and then inclusion and non-discrimination. And I think to help unblock and move that conversation, integrating a human rights approach from the start and at an international level definitely should help.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Magali. And I might actually come back to you, Andreas, now with a related question. And I know you're still in the midst of this process, but it would be really interesting to hear how you've seen FIFA's approach to inclusion change as a result of taking on this commitment to respecting human rights.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's a bit hard to answer since internally in the organization, I wasn't really around the table when the regulations in 2011 were developed. However, what I can say based on my experience of being part of those conversations, maybe a couple of points. First, and Kalekye has done a tremendous service in outlining all the ways in which taking a human rights lens helps us understand harm to people. And I do think since the integration of FIFA's human rights commitment, the organization has taken a much stronger look in terms of how different activities may unintentionally harm people. And human rights as a framework helps us, finding a language to express that in internal conversations, but also towards the outside. Then I think stakeholder engagement, I believe as an organization, we have taken great strides over the last year to forge constructive, trusted relationships with many stakeholders. I do think we are at a completely different point today from what we were maybe 10 years ago as an organization. And then lastly, at a structural level, and I think that's really important, we have a team in the administration focusing on human rights related topics. So adding its views, its perspectives to those processes with a human rights lens in mind. We've also, at the strategic decision-making structures, increasingly human rights related expertise that then helps translate this into the final decisions. And then we have, at least until the end of last year with the Human Rights Advisory Board, had that body of independent external experts who has followed very closely our work, and for whom this particular topic has also been of interest, and they've shared their views with us with respect to the current regulations and where they would see future regulations headed. I think the strategic human rights program that we have been developing over the past years at quite a few levels is shaping also this discussion that we are having right now.
Terrific. Thank you for sharing that. I suppose in some of what we've talked about, I'm still sort of hearing that there is a perceived tension between values like fairness and inclusion and safety and so on. And I suppose a related dimension of this that we haven't yet discussed in detail is this question of whether and how the observation of human rights is or isn't in tension with women's rights in sport, another sort of zero-sum game logic that we've seen become really pervasive in relation to this issue. And I want to come to you, Kalekye, on this point. We really often hear in the sports world that there is this choice to make between the rights of trans women athletes and women with variations in their sex characteristics on one side and women's rights on the other. And Magali referred to this as well. And I find this to be a really interesting but also troubling framing of this issue. I mean, and I'm sure you would be familiar with this, but when Hillary Clinton spoke at the first World Conference on Women back in 1995, so several decades ago, she very famously said that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, once and for all. So, Kalekye, I want to put this question to you. How do we get beyond this dichotomy of women's rights versus human rights? How do you see the observation of human rights in relation to this issue as advancing women's sport and gender equity more broadly?
So you stole the words right out of my mouth, because my first intervention was to rightly state that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And something else we need to keep in mind is that human rights at the end of the day are universal, interdependent, interrelated, and indivisible, and are inherent to all of us. So unfortunately, we've seen over the last years lots of pushback on gender and gender equality, but not only related to that, we've seen that there are harmful gender stereotypes imposed on what being a woman is or what femininity is, that unfortunately perpetuate discrimination and violence against women who are perceived not to conform to the stereotypes. But what I'd like to state is that at the heart of women's rights is the right to bodily autonomy and the right to decide for themselves their own identities. And so being a woman, because women are diverse, and this includes trans women and women with variations in their sex characteristics. And so unfortunately, these harmful gender stereotypes and rules, for example, make trans women vulnerable to high rates of discrimination, violence, abuse, and even killings. And as for women with variations in their sex characteristics, these harmful stereotypes are the same ones that encourage medical and harmful medical practices, such as coerced surgeries on young intersex kids with variations in their sex characteristics to conform to gender stereotypes. So, yeah, that's what I'll have to say now. I wanted to give more information on how this will help women's sport, but I guess in the interest of time, we can put a pause there.
Thanks, Kalekye. And I mean, I know in the Australian context where there are increasingly efforts to expand trans participation in grassroots sport, that we're seeing more and more examples of actually how trans inclusion in club sport is bringing benefits for all participants in club sport. And it's really, I think, interesting to think about how that might scale up to the elite level. I have as a final question, one for Veronica, and which builds actually on Kalekye's response. And as background, my question to you, Veronica, is inspired by an experience that I had back in 2018 at the IWG, International Working Group on Women in Sport meeting in Botswana. And Caster Semenya was one of the speakers. And I remember being struck by how much she was embraced as a role model at this conference, and how many people were dying to ask her a question or get a selfie with her, and how impacted people were by the stories that she shared about the work she's been doing to support girls and young women to get involved in sport. And what struck me was what a missed opportunity it would be for the sport of track and field if we failed to celebrate Semenya as a really important and respected role model for many, many women. So, Veronica, I can only imagine that along your journey, you've seen firsthand how your presence and your voice and your efforts to make sport more inclusive have had a positive impact on sport, including in terms of you being a role model for other athletes. And I was wondering if you could share some of those experiences with us today.
Yeah, I never sought the spotlight. The spotlight sort of found me. I just wanted to race my bike, to be perfectly honest. And I just happened to be in a position as a scholar and an activist and an athlete to be in this unique position to advocate for other trans athletes. And it seriously bothers me when I hear this debate as women's rights versus inclusion, because that already assumes that trans women and intersex women are not women full stop, and that we are not female full stop, because we are. And this pushback of saying, well, we can't have participation at any cost, when the IOC Charter says participation in sport is a human right. Winning is not a human right. Participating is. And one of the problems is that we celebrate exceptional men. So participation at any cost is true for men, but somehow not for women. And I find this confusing. So in 2012, for example, Usain Bolt won his 100-meter event by 1.25% over second place, and Caster Semenya won her event by 0.26% over second place. So Usain won by 5 times the margin that Caster did. Usain has 8 gold medals over 3 successive Olympics and the world records in all his events. Caster had 2 gold medals and no world records, and yet the focus was on excluding Caster, but celebrating Usain. So we celebrate exceptional men and we do not celebrate exceptional women. In fact, we seek to exclude them in the name of fairness, but we don't apply the same standard to men. And so I think this is fundamentally misogynistic and sexist. And so it really scares me that international federations like the IOC are honestly abrogating their duty to enforce, at least at the Olympics. If the Olympics has these values that it states it does, then they can't leave it up to the international federations to pick their own rules that violate human rights. It's honestly, it's beyond frustrating. So I'm put in this uncomfortable position to both advocate on behalf of and yet challenge these international institutions to just do what they say they want to do. I'm not even asking for anything more. So I am honestly worried that the framework, whatever it looks like, and I've been part of that consultation process, will not mean anything if federations like World Rugby can just ban trans women without any evidence. So let me say this. Here's what worries me about saying, well, we must have a sport by sport and maybe event by event approach. I am the only trans woman elite track cyclist at my level in the entire world. It is literally impossible to have a big enough data set to make any informed policy about trans women athletes in my sport. So when you say we should leave it up to a case-by-case basis, they will never have the data to do that. So we need to put human rights and participation first. Trans women and intersex women are women, and we need to stop policing femininity while celebrating masculinity, right? It's this double standard. And so yes, I have had opportunities to be a role model, but I think international federations absolutely underestimate the harm that we feel. So even though my federation allows me to compete and I follow all the rules without any question and under strict scrutiny, I still get death threats and harassment and stalkers, including at races, including by officials. I have people advocating for banning me from sport, even though I'm following all the rules, even though I'm losing almost all of my races. Like my highest world ranking was 85th, and yet people use the language of domination in my performances when I come first and second against another person who came first and second. So 2 of us have the same results, and yet the media language around me is domination. As it's set up, the conflict is not a conflict. Mm-hmm. There should be no restriction on women's participation, period. Stop policing femininity. There is no tension between safety. We allow 230-pound rugby players to play against 90-pound rugby players. And we're concerned about safety about 160-pound trans women. I mean, on its face, this is nonsense. And in men, we have no worries about safety. So if we're only worried about safety for trans women and intersex women and cis women, that looks a little sexist. And let's call it what it is.
Yeah, that double standard is truly striking in the examples that you've put forward. And as you say, Veronica, I mean, I think it's very productive actually to think about now how women's sport what benefits can we find for women's sport in terms of making it inclusive, in terms of challenging those assumptions about femininity that you have mentioned, and the ceiling being put on excellence amongst female athletes. This is our last question to the panel today. I know that people in our audience have been providing comments and putting questions forward today, and I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to those. We can carry on the conversation on the Sporting Chance Forum 2021 website, as well as on social media. We've been using the hashtag SCF21. So please do continue this conversation. I think this is a really good moment to be exploring the points that have been raised by our panelists today in much more detail. I want to thank our panelists today for giving us a sense of what a human rights-based approach is, what's at stake here, why it matters, and how sports governing bodies might go about putting a human rights-based approach into practice. And I'll also thank the Centre for Sport and Human Rights for convening this important and timely panel as part of the Sporting Chance Forum for this year. And a special thanks to Thais Prado for the considerable work that she has done to organise this panel. And I thank all of you in the audience for taking the time to join us today. I'll note that the forum's next live session is going to take place tomorrow at 12 p.m. Central European time. So the title is MSC, Host Cities and Countries Perspectives from a Human Rights-Based Approach to a Game Changer Host. And I believe that this panel is going to be discussing how to host a game changer sporting event and embed human rights throughout an event's life cycle. So that's on tomorrow at 12 p.m. Central European time, when the Sporting Chance Forum 2021 will kick off again. So with that, I will thank all of you and say goodbye for now.
Thank you.